Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking out time to join us in this conference, despite these trying times. My name is Aniakan, and I'll be your facilitator for today's session. I am a global health student at the University of Edinburgh and a member of the Edinburgh Decolonizing Global Health Working Group, the host of this online conference. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and introduce my co-organizers, Ines, Mariana, Marike, Tieng, and Lewis. We're also excited and honored to have our expert speakers with us, Professor Madhu Pai, the Duke Decolonize Global Health Working Group, Professor Yap Boum, Dr. Furaha Asani, and Dr. Ngozi Erondu. Thank you so much for honoring our invitation. For some ground rules of the conference, it is worthy to note that this conference is live streamed on YouTube and will be available after the conference. Also, we have a hashtag which you can use on Twitter to follow the conference. The hashtag is decolonizegh Edinburgh. Decolonizegh Edinburgh. We will be so happy if you can follow the hashtag and probably share the tweet so that the word will go out. Also, we ask that you leave your questions for the speakers in the chat session. We'll be reading from there and asking them to our speakers after they finish their presentation. In case your question is not answered, we guarantee that we will share your questions with the speakers and will also pass your answers back to you. So I'll be running through the agenda now. First, for this agenda, we would have a member of the team, Ines, coming to give us an introduction about who we are and why we're organizing this conference. Also, after that, we'll be hearing from Professor Madhu Pai from the McGill University in Canada on why global health needs to be truly global, diverse, and equitable. This will be followed by a presentation by the Decolonize Global Health Working Group from Duke University in the United States, where they will be sharing lessons learned after organizing a Decolonize Global Health Conference in January this year in the United States. After this, we will proceed for a 5-minute break, just to stretch our legs and grab a cup of coffee. When we come back, we would hear from Professor Yap Boum on why voices from the Global South needs to be elevated in the global health discourse. After that, Dr. Furaha Asani will be sharing on the need for a reframing of the colonial narrative of global health. Finally, to wrap up the session, we would have Dr. Ngozi Erondu, who will be making a case for the decolonization of global health institutions. One key thing that stands out is that our speakers will be speaking from a point of experience, ensuring that real-life experiences and perspectives have brought to bear, and we are so honored to have them. So on behalf of the team, I would like to invite Ines to come and give us an introduction about the conference.
Thank you very much, Aniakan, and welcome again, everybody. So now I'll take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about who we, the Edinburgh Decolonizing Global Health Group, are, why we decided to host this conference, our core goals, and some of the lessons we have learned along the way. So who are we? We're a group of international postgraduate students studying global health at various different departments at the University of Edinburgh. In the past year, we have been inspired by so many of you, especially the Duke Decolonize team, Professor Madhu Pai, Dr. Saya Abimbola, and many, many others of you who have been actively passionate about making global health more equitable. And this has spurred us on to host the first, we believe, UK-based Decolonizing Global Health Conference. But we must say that organizing this conference has already provided so many lessons for us. So one thing to note is that all of us are studying, and most of us actually are living in the global north. So in the future, if we do host another such conference, we will make sure that we partner with groups who are based in so-called low middle income countries and perhaps position ourselves as allies. So who is participating today? We're really happy that so many of you from all around the world have registered to join us. We have 384 of you who registered from 41 countries, including Nepal, Kenya, Oman, and Peru. Naturally, most of our participants have come from the UK, but more problematically, 76% of all the participants who have registered to join are from the so-called high-income countries. So this presents a few concerns to us, and we ask ourselves some questions. Should we be leading these discussions or these efforts to decolonize global health? What should our role be? And how can we potentially involve participants from Africa, Asia, South America in the future? And I'm not going to be answering these questions, but some of the presenters later on will be giving some suggestions of things that we can do. So just to take it a step back, what is the decolonization of global health, and why is it still relevant today? So there is no agreed definition or specific term to say what the decolonization of global health is. It is essentially a movement to make global health more equitable and reduce the many power imbalances that exist within this space. One thing to note is that the term is probably insufficient. It only includes a part of some of the problems that we see in this space, and Professor Madhu will talk about that in a bit more detail later on. But essentially, global health has roots in tropical medicines, and which focuses on infectious diseases and focuses on fixing the many problems that we see in the global south. And this coloniality continues to be comfortably or uncomfortably embedded in our lives through ideological values and social structures that originate from the global north. So many of these unconscious and perhaps also conscious negative practices still exist among global health actors today, whether they're policymakers, practitioners, academics, or funders. And all of this impacts all areas of work, whether it's in research, interventions that happen in the global south, analysis of health in low-income countries, the types of publications, location of decision-making, and funding, where funding comes from. So essentially, the message we want to give you is that global health is not global. The idea of this conference is it's mainly targeted at students of global health. And the idea is to sensitize students to some of these negative practices that we see in this space. These that are partly a reflection of these colonial roots and partly that they're a result of the current power imbalances. And the main goal is to raise awareness of these enduring problematic practices and to hopefully engage a wider audience. So there are many people, many actors who are not fully on board with this movement, and many may see it as perhaps controversial or even a hindrance. But there is definitely a committed effort to doing research in this space. And even us, as we've been kind of studying global health, we were taught very much about these some of these negative and practices and some of the colonial roots of global health. However, it's more difficult to find answers for solutions. So how do we, what do we do practically? How can we change our approaches more practically to make sure that we can minimize some of these detrimental practices in our future work, whether that is inside or outside of academia? So the main idea is that before we, as students of global health, are let loose into the world in the next few months, we just don't want to repeat the same mistakes that people have made in the past or perhaps are still making today. So that's kind of the essential goal. And one thing just to say is that this is a growing movement. There is so much work that's already been going on, and we've been inspired by so many academics who are passionate about this subject, some who aren't joining us today, such as Dr. Seye Abimbola, Dr. Renzo Guinto, and Professor Gavin Yami. And this is a completely incomplete list of people, but these are people who are quite active on social media and in publications who are working in this space, as well as obviously all of our expert speakers who have joined us today. And also students are very much spearheading many of these engagements. So we, as I said, we were inspired by the Duke Decolonize team, who were initially inspired by the Harvard Decolonize team. And then since we've started advertising for our own conference, we've been contacted by students from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and we've also been contacted by students from the Karolinska Institute and actually a few other universities who are looking to run their own conferences. So the movement is growing and growing, which is super exciting. But what is problematic about this picture is that all of these are students based in elite institutions in high-income countries. So still, there's a lot of work to be done, as our expert speakers will discuss in their presentations later on. So that's it. Sorry for the technical issues. Before I wrap up the introduction, I just want to say a huge thank you to a couple of people. So to Professor Devi Sridhar and Professor Liz Grant for sponsoring our conference, for all of our inspirational lecturers at GHPU and the Global Health Academy who've taught us so much about this space. And of course the Duke Decolonize group and all of our experts who are speaking today. And I've included all their Twitter handles, so please do follow all of these wonderful people and groups. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ines, for such an amazing perspective that you shared. You raised a very important point. Is global health truly global? And I think this is a very nice platform that I would like to invite Professor Madhu to continue on the discussion. Is global health truly global? So a brief citation of Professor Madhu. Professor Madhu Pai is a Canadian research chair in epidemiology and global health at McGill University, Montreal. He is the director of McGill Global Health Programs and director of the McGill International TB Center. Madhu Pai did his medical training and community medicine residency in Vellore, India. He also completed his PhD at UC Berkeley and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, San Francisco. Madhu's research is mainly focused on improving the diagnosis and treatment of tuberculosis, especially in high-burden countries like India and South Africa. His research is supported by grant funding from the Gates Foundation, Grand Challenges Canada, and Canadian Institutes of Health Research. He has more than 300 publications. He is recipient of the Union Scientific Prize, Chanjnali Global Health Research Award, Haley T. Dabas Prize, and David Justin Faculty and Staff Award. He is a member of the Royal Society of Canada and a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. So let's make welcome Professor Madhu Pai for his presentation.
Thanks, everyone. It may be easier if I could just move the slides and share my screen. So no, it's okay. You can just move the slides for me, one of you, I guess. Is that okay? No, let me.
You can do it.
Okay, great. All right. Can you see the slides?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. All right. Good morning, good evening to all of you, and I'm really honored to be invited to speak in this event. Before anything else, I think I need to discuss some of my own conflicts and my anxieties about this. First of all, this picture here shows me way back when I was a resident in this rural hospital in India, where we were responsible for taking care of many villages. We used to go out on those white vans and manage community health programs in villages. I remember during those days, we had a lot of American and European students who would come spend time with us for a few weeks at best, and would go back home and publish papers in Lancet and whatnot. And I remember feeling very unhappy that none of us ever got to do that, despite the fact that we clearly knew more about the problems there than any visitor could in a few weeks. But flash forward 25 years, here I am on the right side of the slide, where I'm the director of global health at a leading university in North America, and I'm actively supporting many of our students to go to low and middle income countries to do these global health projects. So you can see that I sometimes worry that whether I'm contributing to the problem or I'm helping solve the problem. The second thing that worries me is that I do now come from a place of privilege. I am a male, and you will see in a bit that matters a lot in global health. It gives me privilege that women don't have. And I'm definitely working in a high-income country university, which also gives me lots of privileges. So I'm acutely aware of this. And as Ines nicely pointed out, as much as we think these are important issues to discuss, it's still clear that those of us who are working in high-income country global health programs have an undue influence, I think, on the global agenda. The only reason why I think I could even give this talk is because I think I see the problem from both sides. I've experienced what global health means living and working in India. I'm now experiencing it in a high income country, and I can see with some clarity what the issues are, and hopefully that might be a useful contribution. Now, I love this movie, The Matrix. It's one of my all-time favorite science fiction movies. And those of you who've seen it will remember that Morpheus offers Neo two options, the blue pill or the red pill. I think global health has the red pill version and the blue pill version. And the blue pill version is that we live in this dreamlike state where everything looks good. And this is the blue pill version of global health, that we do acknowledge that global health has a strong colonial history, colonial medicine, tropical medicine, international health, but we somehow reassure ourselves that this latest iteration of global health is way better than the previous versions. And then if you look at definitions of global health, we all talk about equity being the centerpiece of global health, that global health today is way more reciprocal and partnerships are bidirectional. This is the narrative that I think we would all genuinely like to believe in. But if we did swallow the red pill for a second, what does reality look like in terms of what global health actually is? So I've been slowly, over a period of a couple of years now, trying to explore what the reality of global health is. And I'm certainly not the only one. People have written books about this in the past. But through all these blog posts, I'm slowly trying to dissect one piece after another in terms of, is global health truly equitable? Is it diverse? Is it reciprocal? What are the current realities of global health? So please feel free to dive into any of them, because I have interviewed and quoted dozens of people, including leaders in low and middle income countries in my pieces. And so you will get a more diverse perspective than what I could offer on my own. So in terms of data, since I'm an epidemiologist, I would first present data on what the current state of affairs are in global health, and then we can discuss the implications of what this means. So as always, I think we should begin by asking who sets the global health agenda. So in this context, I was very happy that the Global Health 50/50 report that just came out a little over a month ago presents some really stunning data, which I think is spectacularly important. The Global Health 50/50 project for years has been documenting the lack of gender balance in global health. Men dominated CEO or board chair positions in all the previous reports. But this time around, they also asked, who are these people, right? From which countries do they come from? And then the picture starts emerging much more clearly, in my opinion. So if you look at these nearly 200 global health organizations around the world, question is, where are they headquartered? And you can see a gigantic share of these global health agencies are headquartered in North America and Europe. That would be Seattle, would be Geneva, it'll be New York, it'll be London, it'll be Paris. These are the groups that would dominate global health. And why does this matter? We know the closer you are to an agenda setting place, the greater the control one has over the global health agenda. So these are the places where biggest decisions get made. And if those decisions are about what happens in LMICs, then folks in LMICs currently have little say in how agendas get set about their health or their priorities. Secondly, if you look at the boards of these organizations in terms of who are the board chairs and who are the CEOs or presidents of these global health organizations, it becomes very clear that 70% of the boards are led by men. They're pretty much mostly all men in high income countries, and they are mostly older men in high income countries. Women are a minority, and women from low and middle income countries are the smallest group in terms of representation. So if you look at global health organization, and if you ask a simple question, are they truly global? The answer is no. They're dominated by high income countries. Are they diverse? The answer is no. They're mostly dominated by men, older men in high income countries. Now, if you look at the classic colonial era institutions that were active in the colonial period, it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that pretty much all of them are very important and active even today in terms of their ability to fund, in terms of their ability to publish, in terms of their ability to influence academic universities and decision making. So in many ways, the agenda is primarily controlled by the global north. When we follow the money trail, the situation becomes even clearer. Who finances global health and who puts the money on the table? And here, the best piece of data that we can find is the global burden of disease tracking of development assistance for health. You can see here, the United States is the biggest contributor to global health, which we should now worry a lot about, knowing what Mr. Trump is trying to do to defund WHO and global health. And you can see US, UK, European countries, Canada, Australia, private philanthropies like the Gates Foundation have an extremely big contribution in all aspects of global health. And by contributing money, they control the agenda. And it's as clear as it can be, and we can discuss what this means, especially in the context of the pandemic we are living through. Now, who is publishing global health research studies? Whole slew of studies have been published on this, including by Professor Yap Boum and his collaborators. I mean, it could not be clearer. We don't have time to discuss all of them, but I think the best title I have seen is this paper, Stuck in the Middle. Stuck in the Middle is the best way of describing what happens to collaborative research that is done entirely in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America. The African, Asian, Latin American collaborators are typically middle authors, if they make it on the paper at all. The polar positions, which are most influential, first and senior authorship, is primarily led by authors, researchers from high income countries. And this is true regardless of the disease area, regardless of the journal where it's published, regardless of when in time period you've looked at it. Who is editing? So again, we did a small piece of work here along with a team in India. Both papers are simultaneously published in BMJ Global Health. We just looked at editorial boards of global health journals, and what we found mirrors what you saw earlier in terms of board composition. Global health journals are primarily led by men in high income countries. The least represented on the editorial boards of global health are women from low and middle income countries. Where is the research in global health shared? And here I just did a very quick and dirty study. I looked at the biggest conferences that are held in TB, AIDS, malaria, tropical medicine, and a stunning proportion of them, 80 to 100% across the board, are held in the highest income countries. And it absolutely boggles my mind that the conference on malaria, 100% of them are held in countries with practically no malaria. TB conferences until now were pretty much all held in Paris, Berlin, Barcelona, and not in the highest TB burden countries in the world. Tropical Diseases Conference are held in the United States, and this year it's supposed to be held in Canada. I can't even begin to explain what that means. So, and why does this matter so much? I mean, look at these pieces that have been written about how challenging it is for colleagues in low and middle income countries to even get a visa to enter the countries where these conferences are being held. Right now, try getting a visa to enter the United States or the United Kingdom right now. These are the two most hostile countries as far as participants from LMICs are concerned. And I wish I could tell you that Canada was better. It is not. We've invited participants from all over the world to come to Canada, and many of them have really, really struggled. And in this post-pandemic world that we are approaching, I hope, I would argue that these sorts of hurdles will be infinitely more than they were in the past. I mean, it was bad even last year, but I predict with all the border closures and violations of international health regulations that we are seeing all over the place, we can't even guarantee that the person that we invite, who we want to listen to from an LMIC, will even have a shot at entering the countries where the conferences or events are being held. To that extent, now online conference might be a more distributive way of hearing voices from LMICs, provided they can even access the internet, which is another issue we need to worry about. Now, we also did a small study, which we hope to publish very soon. There are so many degrees now being offered in global health, explicitly called Masters in Global Health or Masters in International Health. So we asked, where are they being offered from? And no surprise, North America and Europe is pretty much all where master's degrees in global health are being offered. And you have to ask yourself, then in that case, who are these degrees really for, right? We know some of the organizers of this conference and those at Duke are all examples of students doing masters in global health, but they're doing it in Edinburgh, they're doing it in Duke University, they're doing it in San Francisco. And how much are they paying? So we looked at the average tuition cost for international students and domestic students. And in North America, whether you're domestic or international, you'll have to shell out something like $60,000 per year as tuition fees. And you have to ask yourself, can anyone in LMIC even think about taking these degree programs? Yes, surely some of them would have gotten scholarships, but you can see that these degrees are primarily intended for students in high income countries. So how exactly are we developing capacity in LMICs is a question we should all be asking of ourselves. And if building capacity in LMIC was a goal, then how does it make sense that these are expensive degrees, primarily located in countries where you can't even get a visa to enter? And then the last piece of data I want to share is this whole issue of reciprocity. So we keep saying that global health today is a lot more reciprocal than before. So I did a two-part series where I looked at the data, I looked at studies, I spoke to a lot of people. And the honest conclusion is, as much as we think reciprocity is important, global health is not delivering on reciprocity today. And I already gave you one small example of how challenging it is to be reciprocal. So sitting here in Canada, we invite people from low-income countries to come to as faculty, and they get denied a visa. So even our own governments sometimes don't understand why reciprocity is important or what we are trying to do. If you look at grants in global health, they're predominantly held by researchers in high-income countries who would then subcontract the money to LMICs. Very few funding agencies directly fund LMIC partners. They fund high-income country partners who then control the money flow And we already saw the imbalance in publications that come out of global health research. So we acknowledge the importance of reciprocity, but we would have to agree that right now we are not doing well in terms of reciprocity. We could be doing much better than what we are doing right now. So my key takeaways from the work that I have shared with you is that every aspect of global health, whether it's research, funding, teaching, degree programs, conferences, you name it, it is dominated by folks in high-income countries who clearly benefit more than colleagues in LMICs. This is the blunt truth, and this is the red pill version of global health. And I think the first step in doing anything about this lack of equity, lack of reciprocity, is to just wake up, which is why I think the matrix analogy is so important. And you take the red pill, you wake up, you see the reality for what it is. We may not like the reality. Sometimes I think it's great to take a blue pill and just get on with life. But waking up, I think, is the first step. And I think many of the students who are leading these conferences on decolonizing global health are all waking up, or they have woken up. And as they get woken up, they're trying to wake up others, which I think is exactly why these conferences are starting to spread around the globe. The more people who swallow the red pill in global health, I think the better this field is going to look like. So when we take a red pill, we will read more about what is wrong with global health. We will discuss more, as we are doing right now. We will be more reflective on our own privilege or the lack of balance in global health. We also need more critical courses in global health, the courses that show us the red pill version of global health, not the blue pill version of global health. We need to do the kind of research studies that people have done, or what I showed you. Just ask a simple question: who's publishing? Where is the action happening? Where are the global health degrees? How much do they cost? These sorts of research studies are simple to do, but they're powerful because they give us data to tell us how skewed global health is. And I will talk a little bit more about how folks in high income countries, people like me, will have to deliberately and thoughtfully lean out. We always worry about all male panels. I think along the same lines, we have to now worry about global health panels or meetings where we only have people from high income countries. If we did that, we would be no different from a group that had only an all male session. I think we also must pivot, especially in this crisis, that global health is not just about students or faculty in high income countries running off to save low and middle income countries. They must also focus on locally relevant inequities. Health inequities are to be found everywhere. United States is a great example. UK is a great example. They're both struggling right now, and global health students must find a way to contribute to local inequities and problems. We have to increase reciprocity. And then lastly, we have some huge structural problems to tackle, and that's where I will finish. So in terms of this leaning out and leaning in, all of us have seen that book by Sheryl Sandberg, encouraging women to lean in. There's no question that not just women should lean in, but colleagues in LMIC should also lean in, because they have great insights that we really desperately need in global health. But since the real estate in global health is completely cornered by older men in high income countries, as the data clearly shows, I ask myself, will anything fundamentally change if older men in high income countries don't thoughtfully, deliberately lean out and vacate the position for others who need it? I mean, anytime you see a bunch of men on a panel on women's reproductive rights, or there was a panel on maternal and newborn health with only men, you have to ask yourself, I mean, what is wrong that they are just not even able to see the problem in that whole setup, right? Is that not something that even occurs to them that is the problem? The only way I can justify is that they are in the matrix. They have not woken up. They are unable to see what they are unable to see. So when men wake up and they realize something is seriously imbalanced, I think they can and should actively create room for the key stakeholders to come in. And so at a minimum, I would argue that established older men who've already made it to the top of their careers is the group that should start leaning out, because they are the ones who are controlling every aspect of global health right now. And I suppose that includes people like me. So this leaning out, I can assure you, does not come naturally. Certainly it didn't come naturally to me. I have had to work extra hard on this. And I predict that is true for many other men in high income countries as well. And I'll give you an example. I write a lot. And these days when I write and I interview people, before I hit the publish button, I sit and count. How many people have I interviewed? How many men? How many women? How many from high income countries? How many from low income countries? And it's almost like I need to do this. It seems kind of like the checklist approach, but I worry that if I didn't do that, then by default, I'll end up with quoting a bunch of men in high income countries in my writings. And that's the point I'm making about the need for a deliberate, thoughtful approach rather than assume that somehow magically I will get it and I will do the right thing. Maybe one day it'll become second nature to me, but right now I have to work very hard at making sure. So that's why I suggested that we cannot have this particular conference with only speakers from high income countries. It's again a deliberate, thoughtful exercise. And you have to keep on pointing out that this panel is wrong. This doesn't make sense. And those of us who are established have the voice to point that out. And if we don't do it, then it's a lost opportunity. So anytime anybody invites me, I have the ability to say, I'm sorry, but this doesn't make sense. You need to be more global and diverse. And the ability to use our voice, I think we're underusing it, is what I'm saying. The other thing is, in terms of this leaning out, I really enjoyed this article published in Al Jazeera, where the author, David Bari, is saying, well, this crisis is a situation where the West is now focused on its own survival. Nobody is rushing in to save Africa, for example, from COVID-19. So maybe, intentionally or not, people in HICs have leaned out of COVID because they have their own fires to put out, which means colleagues in LMICs have the opportunity, as he says, to wean themselves off of exploitative neo-colonial relationships. So if any good comes out of this pandemic, it would be that our colleagues in LMICs find their own path and don't wait for anyone to come and save them. And then continuing on this issue of what this pandemic can and cannot do to global health, I interviewed a large number of colleagues, including some who are on the phone line, and asked the question, what would global health look like post-pandemic? So me and others, we came up with a bunch of positives that we see. And we came up with a bunch of negatives that this pandemic will do to global health. In terms of positives, I think it's easy to understand that everybody now acknowledges that the world is one when it comes to health, right? What happens in Wuhan will affect New York one day. So we are all in this together. Global solidarity, that we need to worry about every country rather than just our countries. That health is wealth, that if you don't invest in health, you're going to pay trillions in economic losses because of that. That universal health coverage is important. You cannot have massive numbers of people who are not covered. That public health matters. It's valuable. It's silent, but it's valuable. And I'm hoping a positive fallout will be a stronger World Health Organization, one that is well-funded, and has the mandate to actually do something. And then, as we saw from the previous piece by David, self-reliance among low and middle income countries would be another positive fallout of this, that they lead their own agenda and folks from HICs basically stay out. The negatives, unfortunately, is a long list and it's very stressful. And I will show you in a second that the negatives are very real. First, as high income countries see the economies collapsing, I worry that they will start cutting foreign aid or development assistance to help. They will focus on domestic agendas and they will have a huge number of people demanding that they do so. Extreme securitization, that everything will be seen through the global health security prism, that if it is not a pandemic threat, it is unlikely to get funded or supported. We're already seeing a rise in nationalism, isolationism, and xenophobia in many countries. And this is particularly evident in the United States, United Kingdom, India. It is becoming really challenging to do anything when the entire environment is dominated by this nationalism and open isolationism. And if LMICs get hit hard by COVID and suffer huge economic losses, I worry that they may be more dependent on aid from HICs, which will not come. And then if HICs are still the dominant force, I worry that the power imbalance in global health will be substantially worsened because of this pandemic. And here are all examples of this set of negatives currently visibly being played out. Aid is already being disrupted. Hate against people of Asian origin is rising. Donald Trump is threatening to defund WHO. He is threatening to kill immigration. Everything that we mentioned here is actually already happening right now. And so if this is how global health is going to be in the future, what do we do? I argue that any of us working in global health, our workload has dramatically increased. We have much bigger mountains to climb than we did even last year. And as depressing as this all looks, I must say, and I've said this before as well, the only bright spot that I see are the young people. And why do I say that? I think young people are able to see through the bullshit that the adults are simply not able to see. They can see the planet in crisis that the adults are simply not able to see, which is why when you look at climate change activism, it's the youngest people who are seeing with great clarity that the older men who worry about the economic growth and are simply not able to see it. I think younger people have no vested interests in supporting something that benefits them. They're able to see things with so much more clarity. Take gun violence in America, for example. The youngest people are getting slaughtered in their schools because of gun violence. And while their own politicians have done nothing to end gun violence, nothing, they have in fact sold themselves to the gun lobby, the young people have taken to the streets to demand that guns, assault weapons be banned. I mean, people like Malala and Greta are able to say things that nobody in their traditional establishment is even dreaming of saying in public. So to me, this conference and others like it that happened at Duke and will happen at other universities are again led by the youngest people in global health, because they are not benefiting from the power structures that the older people are benefiting from. They're able to call out the bullshit that established people in global health will never call out. So I'm sorry that the adults have let everybody down, the youngest people down, but I somehow think that there is no other choice but to listen to those voices that are free of corruption and are able to speak the truth, which needs to be said in the area of global health. So with that, I thank all the young people who've done an amazing job of putting this conference together and my fellow panelists, and I look forward to taking any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pai, for such an amazing session, especially the fact that colleagues from the Global South need to consciously lean in, while colleagues from the Global North should consciously lean out to ensure that equity in global health is quite established. So thank you so much for that amazing session, Professor Pai. And I would like to invite my colleague Mariana to take us on some question and answer session.
Hello, Professor Pai. We have a question that was posted to our Twitter, and it says, should we only be focusing on health in our countries and regions in high-income countries? What then is our role in global health if we are based in the global north? If we step back, will the global south be empowered?
What a fantastic question. One that worries me a lot. So let's see this as a pendulum. Many of us who are in high income countries and who are in global health academic programs for about, I don't know, 10 years, 20, 30 years, we've all swung towards going and working in LMICs, right? That's how we see ourselves, our role as. And that came at the neglect, I think, of some of serious inequities within our own countries, right? Now, this COVID pandemic is exposing all of those inequities within our own borders and demanding that we focus locally as well, because how do we be relevant in an ongoing crisis, right? But if we went all the way to just focusing on our own problems, then we have lost the whole global solidarity issue, right? So there is either extreme is probably bad. The pendulum swung too much towards folks in high income countries only worrying about LMICs and not doing what they could be doing within their own borders, to an extreme sense of nationalism that we're only going to focus on our issues. We'll stop international aid. We'll stop technical assistance to LMIC. I see threats in both extreme positions. The way I would probably say it is that some of us, whether by training or whether by where we were born or whatever, are probably better off focusing on where we really have serious credibility and competence. And therefore we should do that. And some of us legitimately, justifiably will focus on domestic inequities, and that should be perfectly acceptable. But right now, if you look at professors of global health, all the inspiring professors of global health, they're all running off the LMICs to save the world. And that inspires the younger people who want to be like them. Think Paul Farmer, for example, right? You see Paul Farmer, you see him in Haiti, you see him in Rwanda, and all the students in America who inspired to get into global health want to be like Paul Farmer and do that. I think we need Paul Farmers of the world, some Paul Farmers, to focus on domestic inequities and become inspiring role models for people who want to follow them. I think we need both Paul Farmers, the Paul Farmers who might do serious international work and the ones who will do domestic work, because this crisis has shown that there are huge issues even within HICs. And to not tackle them and call yourself as somebody who's working in global health seems like an opportunity lost. So I think balance is what I'm asking for.
Thank you very much for that. And the next question is, there is an overarching theme in your critical remarks, which is around hiring and resourcing for global health positions. What would you say, or what would you advise to people who work in those organizations or are related to global health inside or outside academia about how their hiring process can be improved, or what can be done to be more equitable and representative, more diverse?
So typically, because of the way funding flows in global health, monies usually go to an NGO or an agency within high-income countries. They then sub the money to an LMIC partner organization who might hire LMIC-based field workers. So if you look at the pyramid of the healthcare workforce, typically at the lower end of the pyramid, community health workers, people who are working in the front lines will be hired locally, right? But as you go up the pyramid, their managers and their managers' managers and the supervisors are typically high-income country folks who are based in high-income countries who might fly in and fly out, but are not necessarily even living right there. And so this is how it has been for decades. And this will never change fundamentally unless monies are directly going to LMICs. That is when you will see real ownership and hiring of local people who know a lot. There's been a lot of debate and backlash recently about consulting companies in global health, right? There was a piece about McKinsey, BCG, so on and so forth. And this is typically how it is done, right? These consulting companies are all headquartered in the global north, and they will command huge amounts of money, hourly rates for their staff, but they are going and consulting in LMICs, right? So for that amount of money, could you not hire many more talented experts on the ground who really understand the LMIC? The answer is yes. But does it happen? The answer is no, because of how these consulting companies, where they're headquartered and how they manage to get big grants and contracts, and not the in-country experts.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Pai, for that amazing contribution. I think the key takeaway from that is that we need to look at global solidarity as the way forward. There must be solidarity between colleagues from the global south and also from the global north. So thank you so much for that presentation, and I believe that our audience have learned a lot from it. We will now listen to the presentation from the Decolonizing Global Health Student Group from Duke University. While the slides are going to be up, I'd like to take their citation. The Duke Decolonizing Global Health Student Working Group was formed by Andrea Koris, Laura Nkumba, Ali Murad Boum, Cordella Kenny, and Yerdoshini Ravidran in 2018. As Global Health Master students, they saw the need to have more in-depth conversations about global health and its root in oppressive systems. They wanted to create a space to investigate global health history and acknowledge the spaces they occupy as future global health practitioners and researchers. They hosted the Decolonizing Global Health 2020 conference in January with great success and set a path for us to follow. They have also been our allies and supported us when we were just starting to conceive this Edinburgh chapter of this movement. So let's welcome the Decolonizing Global Health Working Group from Duke University.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. Ines, I think you guys can share your screen and I'll just let you know when to advance since it's
okay.
a group presentation.
Yep.
Okay, good morning, everyone. And I want to once again thank the Edinburgh team for allowing us to be a part of this conference. My name is Laura Makumba, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Duke Decolonizing Global Health Working Group. And I, along with my colleagues, Ali and Cordelia, will be presenting on the lessons we learned from the conference we held in January, future steps, and how we're applying the decolonizing conversation during COVID-19. So you can move on to the next slide. So I'm going to just start quickly by talking a little bit about us, so you can move on to the next slide. So as Aniken mentioned, we formed our working group in September of 2018, and this really came out of frustration with the way that global health was being taught and how we'd seen global health being practiced in our professional experiences. So like we mentioned earlier, so Laura, Yadu and Andrea are the co-founders of the Decolonizing Global Health Working Group. And then the other members are Ali and Cordelia, who will actually, after Andrea, Yadu, and I graduate, will be taking over the mantle and continuing the conversation at Duke. You can go to the next slide, please. So the mission of our working group is to create a safe space for students, practitioners, and researchers to challenge the oppressive legacy of colonialism in global health and to work towards a future that is anti-colonial, anti-racist, and non-exploitative. And we wanted to accomplish this mission by starting a conversation at our home institution, Duke University, and also challenging the way that it was being taught and how the curriculum was being centered, because we found that the curriculum in many, and not just at Duke and in many institutions, was very ahistorical and apolitical, in that we talk about health inequities in Black and brown communities. And the truth of the matter is that is due to colonialism. That is due to the history of colonialism and the legacy of colonialism and slavery and other oppressive systems. So we held several events in our time at Duke. And you can go to the next slide. But one of the events that our group hosted was the Decolonizing Global Health Conference in January of this year in 2020. And we had over 750 in-person and online attendees. And we had 7 speakers from all over the world and who are also from all various disciplines, talking about how they theorize decolonizing global health, and also giving us lessons on how we can practically move forward for decolonizing global health. So just move on to the next slide. So the conference had several benefits. One, it opened our space within our institution to include an activist, health justice, and decolonized orientation. And 2, it helped expand and connect the network of students, faculty, practitioners, and researchers committed to decolonizing global health locally and globally. So as we see here today, by having this conference, we started conversations and social media, and with the Edinburgh students, and now we're seeing that this movement is continuing with other students and in other continents. And there are other lessons that we've learned, and we'll highlight through today. One, the theoretical, and one our conference is that we were very focused on theory. We started the conference by really talking about what decolonizing theory looks like. And talk about the studies and the need to really remain grounded in practice and really remain grounded in practical solutions for moving forward. So as Dr. Pai mentioned, one example of a practical solution is those are the intersections of privilege, actively leaning out, making that deliberate, thoughtful action to lean out in order for those who are marginalized and from those from in LMICs who don't have a voice or have historically been ignored to lean in and have their voices heard. So I'm going to move it on over to my next colleague to present the rest of the presentation.
Next slide, please. Thank you so much, Laura, for setting the scene. My name is Cordelia Kenny, and I'll just share a few of our working group's priorities moving forward. So in the year ahead, we'll focus on 3 broad areas for our working group, which are organized under the themes of build, change, and connect. So I'll start with building. As Laura mentioned, the conference was a really important way of expanding the space on campus to confront and explore some of the issues that we've talked about today, including these deeply entrenched inequities and injustices that we see in global health, in the way it's practiced, the way that it's taught, and the way that it's conducted. A big takeaway from the conference that we heard from our colleagues was how valuable having this kind of space is. And so for the coming year, we're going to prioritize ways to facilitate this kind of dialogue, both within our cohort and for the incoming class joining Duke in the fall. And the second broad priority is to focus on change. So again, as Laura's mentioned, and relating to this change in the conversation among current students, we plan on working with DGHI faculty and staff to develop and implement curricular and institutional changes that reflect the direction in which we hope to see the program go. Some of the core class faculty have already shown interest in, after the conference, in shaping their courses from a decolonizing lens. And this semester, actually, 2 of our core classes that we took included discussions on decolonization. So we take that as a very important step forward and moving in the right direction. We've also, this semester, had some productive conversations with the education team and are looking forward to working with them to implement a series of recommendations to help DGHI shift its culture and practices more toward one of inclusivity, equity, and critical reflection. The third and final pillar that will comprise our focus for the coming year is on connection. So as this virtual conference demonstrates, there is continued interest and passion for growing the decolonizing global health movement. And we're really excited to see more and more students and schools worldwide carry this conversation forward. And exactly as has also been mentioned before, we really hope and are looking forward to seeing more of these conversations happening, not in high-income countries, but also in low and middle-income countries as well. A key priority that came up out of the past year was the need to connect the dots across the world and linking up all these different individuals and groups who have shown this interest and this passion to create a global action platform. In some ways, COVID-19 has emerged during a very critical period, also as Dr. Pai has mentioned, and as Laura has mentioned, the pandemic has illuminated the devastating inequality and imbalanced access to resources, power, and even basic safety and welfare. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic will likely have significant impacts for our group's activities in the coming year, depending on how long things continue to be virtual, but as this virtual conference has demonstrated, and if anything, it's already come up during today's discussion that this situation has really underscored the critical importance of this movement and the need to keep having these conversations. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ali.
Thank you, Laura and Cordelia. We talked about the conference and its outcomes, but I want to talk about a little bit about COVID and its implications in perpetuating colonialism. Next slide, please. So although it's a bit cliche, I want to start by comparing the coronavirus to a mirror. While it has reflected solidarity and interdependence, as Dr. Pai said, it has also truly revealed the dysfunctional sides of our society from a very interdisciplinary lens. So healthcare, politics, economy, sustainability, the list goes on and on. As Dr. Pai said in his presentation, HICs that hold the funds hold the global decision-making. And so we can observe firsthand the consequences of discriminatory colonial discourse and practices across the globe, from hate speech to exploitation, profit. The COVID-19 mirror has really revealed the true appetite humans possess to wield power over welfare. And next slide, please. And so the media is currently filled with images regarding hate speech, assault, social isolation of Asians, and overall spike of toxic patriotism. This mindset not only stems from the desperate scapegoating and previously suppressed perceptions of exoticism, but also from politicized discourse manipulation and gaslighting, which we clearly see in the US, for example. It's crucial to distinguish that COVID has resurfaced and not created these racist, anti-Asian, discriminatory ideologies in Western society, hence a really good look in the mirror. COVID has also significantly influenced academia and the workplace overall. I should rather say it revealed their unforgiving nature when it comes to normalcy. Notions such as business as usual, work from home, neglect low-paying industries such as retail, dining, as well as vulnerable groups and families that are directly affected by this virus and in need of funds. For many, not leaving home will push them into significant economic hardship. In fact, studies indicate that those able to work remotely are statistically more well off and have better education. In 2018 in the US, 47% of workers with a bachelor's degree or higher worked from home sometimes, compared to just 3% of workers with only a high school diploma. And this is Bureau of Labor Statistics data. The rates of joblessness are catastrophic worldwide. This is only one example of many showing that, I want to say, the precariousness of capitalism, especially in facing catastrophe. We also can't forget about the appalling proposal of vaccine tests in Africa, Trump's tweets reflect a lot of current colonialist ideals. And so there's still a lot more work to be done in terms of real life situations such as the pandemic that we saw, as Dr. Pai stated. Next slide, please. And so that was a very brief overview. Thank you so much for joining us today. We would be very pleased to stay in touch after the conference. We've included our contact information. If there's time, we also would love to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Ali, for such an amazing presentation and for also being an inspiration to young people like us in the university on how we can take the future that we design into our hands and begin to work towards it. So thank you very much, you and your team, for such an amazing presentation. I would now like to invite Mariana to lead us on the question and answer session.
Hello. The first question is, what roadblocks did you come across from either academia or your fellow peer students? This topic makes people uncomfortable. How do we address that?
There were several roadblocks. I think the first thing, as Dr. Pai mentioned, everyone needs to get woke. Everyone needs to wake up. And I think people at our institution, we're in various stages of waking up. And it can be very difficult to have uncomfortable conversations when you're still half asleep and you're not really conscious to the positionality that you're occupying and not really conscious to, what you're doing in this field. So one of the roadblocks was really communicating effectively what our mission was with decolonizing global health. And also not limiting the movement to a list of checkboxes, because there was a big push of providing concrete ideas. We mentioned about moving from theory to practice. However, it's a fine balance of moving into practice, but also not reducing the movement and the conversation to a list of checkboxes. So I think our main two roadblocks were, one, people are being in various stages of waking up and not being conscious to the movement and the conversation. And then two, having the conversation without reducing it to a series of checklists to then say, congratulations, DGHI is not colonized, or Duke University is now decolonized. So those were kind of two major roadblocks. And then I think one is just being master's students and writing our theses and taking classes. And some of us were working 2 to 3 jobs along with that, and just 24 hours a day not being enough to do everything. But yeah, I'll let my colleagues chime in as well.
I think one other thing that we took out of this was our stance was really important in our language. So the way we approached it as, especially talking to institutions, we're in this together. We really want this to be fruitful for both sides and not just for students. We're not throwing our demands just for the sake of our own welfare. We're doing it for future cohorts. We're doing it for, to make more sustainable, more impactful changes within the institution. So I think we had to really make sure to frame it from that sense rather than antagonizing an institution or creating some sort of distance that would prevent these changes from happening in the first place.
Definitely. And then just to add in terms of students, I think, and of course my colleagues can chime in if this is inaccurate, but I think one thing we found was that it's not necessarily an issue of opposition, but more an issue of not being willing or not being, I guess, far enough along the pathway from being asleep to being awake to taking that step to be more engaged. So I think, one of the things that the conference really showed us was that there are lots of students among our cohort and among our class in our school, but also all around the world who are interested in this, but who just maybe don't have maybe the tools or the motivation to really take it a step further and do something a little bit more action oriented. So I think that also, could be interpreted as a roadblock in terms of how do you get that cluster of people who are so interested in this to really become more invested and more involved. But I think, yeah, that would be on the student side. It was generally very, very receptive.
Thank you very much. Just a brief comment to say that we see your questions in Twitter. Please keep asking them. And one more question for the Duke team is, what do you see as the main challenge to transform academic and research institutions regarding decolonization of global health? And sorry, no, wrong one. Bear with me, technical difficulties. Oh, is either one of you planning to work outside of academia, and how has this experience informed your job search or your career plans for the future? Has this changed you in any way, or yeah?
I can start, I guess. I think that my colleagues, Andrea and I, since we're graduating in a week, is obviously the pandemic has thrown a wrench in some of our plans and what we'd dreamed of doing after graduation. We'd certainly, I think I'm speaking for all of us, that we wanted to be in the field. We wanted to, really take what we'd learned in our program, both just the research skills, but also from these critical reflections that we've had through the decolonizing movement. And unfortunately, we've had to change that and shift that a little bit just due to, economies not being ideal, and also, because it's just logistically, we cannot travel out of the country. I can give an example for myself. I'm originally from Tanzania, and I wanted to go back home and work in the field in Tanzania. And that's unfortunately not something that I can do right now. However, wherever I do end up, and I think I can speak for the three of us, wherever we do end up, that one thing that we've been very conscious about is continuing this conversation and bringing this mindset of decolonization into wherever we end up. And while it may not be what we'd dreamed and hoped for, realizing that we still have to have that deliberate and critical reflection, constantly asking ourselves, what positions are we occupying? Asking ourselves what baggage, both historically and what privilege baggage are we bringing into these spaces that we're going into? Are we in a position to lean out in order to have somebody else lean in? And also, are we in a position to really say, to challenge those oppressive systems that we might encounter, both in our future job searches? And then also, I do know that we all eventually want to continue with education and continue with academia. So we're taking time off to work and kind of have that professional experience, but we do also intend to stay in academia. But I'll let Yadu and Andrea if they want to add anything else.
Yeah, I'll just add on to what Laura said. Something that the three of us have talked about a lot as well is, there's this myriad of institutions that you can work for, you can work with, and it's really important, like Laura said, to do that individual work. But we are faced with this kind of intractable challenge when the institutions that we have the opportunity to join as workers are not transformed yet. So there's this the point that Laura made about, like, are we in positions of power to challenge the oppressive systems that we will inevitably be joining and becoming a part of, is something that I don't think we have the answer to, but is a question that this kind of global group of young people that are posing these questions can counter and debate.
All right, thank you so much for your contributions, and most importantly, that the path for critical reflection might not necessarily end in school, but it's a journey that we have to keep going on with to ensure that those particular inequities are dismantled. So thank you once again, and thank you also for the participants who will now have to proceed for a 5-minute break so that we can stretch our legs and grab a cup of coffee. So we'll be coming back in the next 5 minutes where we'll take the presentation by Professor Boum. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Hi, Prof. I just wanted to say I'm really looking, this is Furaha speaking. I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
I hope you will enjoy. It will be short, but
anything that you have to offer us is most appreciated.
I'm also really looking forward. I think it's a really great thing that you are doing, and I really hope that it will spread out worldwide in the continent and everywhere.
Yeah.
Really.
Thank you so much for all of you.
And my name is Boum, B-O-U-M, Boum.
All right, so thank you so much everyone for joining us again. We will now hear from Professor Yap Boum. But before he proceeds with his presentation, I would like to take his citation. Professor Yap Boum is the regional representative for Epicenter Africa, the research arm of Médecins and Frontières, also known as Doctors Without Borders. He's currently based in Yaoundé, Cameroon, and from 2009 to 2014, Boum headed the Epicenter's research base in Mbarara, Uganda, leading research projects that included tuberculosis and malaria. Most recently, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, he was involved in the Ebola outbreak and the use of the Ebola vaccine for MSF. Boum has a professorship in microbiology at Mbarara University of Sciences and Technology in Uganda and teaches public health and microbiology at the universities of Yaoundé in Douala, Cameroon, and in Virginia in the US. Boum is a co-founder of Madhu Pai, a nonprofit that developed washable sanitary pads to empower women and allow them to more fully participate in their education. Madhu Pai also aims to have a critical impact on the huge amount of waste generated by the use of non-reusable sanitary pads. In all his work, Boum is inspired by the vision of a healthy and wealthy Africa. As an Archbishop Tutu Fellow, he aims to advance research and innovative solutions and to promote the creation of a critical mass of young Africans to address the social and public health challenges Africa faces. We now welcome Professor Yap to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Aniken, for the introduction. Very nice introduction. It's always feel nice to have the feedback. So, as mentioned, I work for Epicenter, Epicenter being the research arm of Doctors Without Borders. I've been working with Epicenter for the last 11 years now. Time can really rush. And Epicenter, as you mentioned, has been created by Doctors Without Borders to improve the quality of the work that MSF is doing in the field. So what's the field that we are working with or working in is different parts of the world, but I'm mainly working in Africa, specifically in Cameroon, in Uganda, where we have our research center, but also in Niger and DRC, Guinea, depending on what is happening in the continent. And one of the challenges that I've been facing for the last 11 years that I've been working with MSF and Epicenter is what is the actual contribution or recognition of African researchers in the research done in the continent. We know that Africa contributes toward 2% of the global research. But I was really focusing within that 2%, where are the Africans? Though Professor Madhu have already mentioned those papers, the first one was stuck in the middle. The question we were asking ourselves in this paper is, if you're an African researcher working with a top universities, American-based university, Europe-based university, what is the chance that you will be in a position to publish, to be acknowledged, and where will you publish? Just to remind people that in publication, as you see, there is a number of people who appear in the publication, and the most critical position are the first one and the last one, the first and the senior. So we realized, though we had some ideas, that actually the African researchers, even as you see in that very paper, are stuck in the middle. The first author was Bethany, who was a great researcher who is really pushing the agenda for global equity. And Jim Volmick are the people who led that research, because they've realized that it's critical to bring that messages that African who are doing the research in a continent are stuck in the middle, are not recognized. And the more you work with a global top 5 university in the US, the less likely you are to be in the most important position. So if you are not in the most critical position, then we move, the second paper is who is telling the story. As you also know, the people who would first design the story. Can we go back to the slide before? The people who actually design the study, who have the responsibility, the principal investigators, are usually the senior one, the last author. But then when you are done with the implementation of your study, the analysis and all that, you write the paper. So writing an article is writing a story. So the person who have the responsibility to write the latest version of that article, of that story, is actually the person who tells the story. And the point we were making here is that we look at 7 infectious diseases: high burden, HIV, TB, low burden, borreliosis ulcers, and also we also include Ebola, and just to see where are the African. Are they first? Are they left? Are they somewhere in the middle? And we realize that only 30 to 40% of all those publications during that time frame, only 30 to 40% had an African as first or last authors, meaning that 70% of them are led by people who are not African, therefore telling a story that somehow are not fully the stories. And most strikingly is that we even have some article where there were zero African in the article for a research done in Africa. And I was asking myself, how is that possible? How can people come with their drone and then capture the sample, capture the data without working with anybody in the field? Crazy. I remember I was reviewing an article for a good journal, actually a Lancet. And this was an article with all the authors being also from the West, talking about malaria in the continent, in Africa. And my first and major review was that's not acceptable. And just based on that, they rejected the paper, which is quite important. There is no way a journal should accept that. So the point with those 2 articles is to also highlight that there are different levels of responsibilities for the researchers, for the funders, for the journal, for quite of all the people involved in the ecosystem. So now in the next slide, you will recognize Donald Trump. Some of you will also recognize the guy in the other picture with the hat, who has become very famous, Professor Didier Raoult, who actually is a great virologist. I had a chance to work in his unit 10 years ago in La Timone in Marseille. Really great virologist. So when the COVID-19 started in his hospital, he realized that chloroquine may have a positive impact on the patient that he was following because of all the work he has been doing in malaria and with other malaria and chloroquine before. So he followed, at that time, it was around 23 to 24 patients, and seeing some very promising results with chloroquine having an impact in the reduction of the viral load of the virus. So based on those results, he decided that he will now provide chloroquine to all his patients coming to the hospital. And another hospital in France did the same. Despite the Ministry of Health in France authorizing the use of chloroquine. And they had no choice eventually but to accept. And then you have Trump who say, just take it, just give it. There's no harm. And now we are realizing that actually there is harm. We have people who are doing overdose of chloroquine. We have people who have having adverse event, especially those who have other comorbidity, cardiac issue, and so on. Next slide. So now, based on that as well, what happened in Africa? Quite a number of countries, including Senegal, including Cameroon, and I think Guinea as well, have decided to add chloroquine and azithromycin in the standard of care for COVID-19. Considering that the evidence from 24 patients were enough. I'm a researcher, so I've learned that if you want to assess the efficacy of a drug or a vaccine, you do a randomized clinical trial where you provide the drug to one group, a placebo or a different drug to another group, and you compare. This was not done. But we in the continent, we have simply inherited those findings, those results, and decided to put it in the standard of care, despite the fact that we don't have the capacity to actually monitor how those patients will do when they will be on that drugs. It's again, you've seen in the picture that I've showed before with Professor Raoul in Senegal, and then in that article he was called Big African Brothers. So we still have that colonial link that because it's coming from Marseille, from France, then we have to use it, regardless of our reality. Next slide. So now, you may also have heard about the comment from two French researchers. It was, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago, talking about vaccine in Africa, testing COVID vaccine. And they were saying that Africa, because there are no mask, there are no ventilator, and so far and so on, should be the place where the vaccine should be tested. And based on that specific particular extract of the conversation, all the continent, rightly based on that extract, slammed those researchers as racist, that is Dr. Tedros from the World Health Organization, including our top football star. Maybe some of you will recognize Didier Drogba and Samuel Eto'o that were denouncing the COVID-19 vaccine trial in Africa. It's also interesting to see now going backward to the issue of colonialism, how Africa can definitely react and somehow overreact based on what was actually the fact. Now here, our dear Madhu, write a very nice piece saying that the BCG against coronavirus, less hype and more evidence. And what he was simply asking is to base on evidence, because the vaccine that was mentioned was the BCG vaccine, because those people somehow realized or observed that country where the vaccine has been implemented has less case and maybe less death of COVID-19. So they make a kind of correlation and say, maybe it can work. And based on that, people start thinking that it can work. And those two researchers who were already doing or planning to do a study in Australia and different countries were actually saying that Africa should be a priority to be able to provide evidence, not to just start vaccinating everyone with the BCG vaccine because we've heard that it might work somewhere, but to actually provide evidence, local evidence. And this coalition to accelerate COVID-19 clinical research in resource-limited setting is also a group that realized that it is critical for Africans to find their own solution. Because what works in Australia, in the US, in France, might not work in Africa. And again, Africa is not one country. It's 54 or 56 countries, so with different realities. So we definitely have to try in our setting what was for us. You may have heard what is happening in Madagascar, where they are trying their own herbal plant that they manage to manufacture as a treatment for COVID-19. And now they've kind of scaled the production. And the feedback from the community, international community, is that it hasn't gone to the methodology of testing, which is right. But what they say, their response was quite interesting. And they were sending back a message to the West saying that, okay, you count your case, you count your death, and we'll do the same at the end, which was quite interesting. So, but how can we have the capacity to do our own research? We need funding. In his presentation, Professor Madhu has highlighted the challenge that might come as COVID is moving, because now the burden is happening everywhere, which means there's less resource for Africa, for the low and medium income countries. Also, Donald Trump is cutting the funding to WHO, which is supporting quite significantly the LMICs. So what do we have? We have billionaires. Africa have never had as many billionaires as now. Dangote, Motsepe, and all those people. We need to go and talk to those people so that they can take some part of their money and do like their friends. They are enjoying happily being talking and dining with Gates and the others. It's also critical for them to learn from their friends and to say, okay, why are you spending as much money in global health, in research? And we hope that they will do the same with us. So here, in the last slide, what we need to decolonize global health is to have equitable global health partnership, either for research or simply for medical action. But something that we believe is the resilience of our continent. This picture is my daughter. She's called Ashanti. In the introduction, Anika
I think we missed Professor Yap there. I don't know if that's... Ines, you have to unmute. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I was going to say, I suggest then if we can move on to the next presentation, and then we can ask, when Professor Yap, we can hear him again, we can direct the questions to him after Dr. Furaha Asani's presentation. We'll ask them both at the same time, if that's okay.
All right. So thank you so much for that. I'm just going to do a brief introduction of Dr. Furaha as we get ready to present her slides.
Can I just interrupt to say, I think it would probably work better if I share my screen so that I can control how I move between slides. And is that okay?
I just set you up to do it, yeah.
Thank you.
So welcome once again, Dr. Furaha. Thank you so much for honoring our invitation. So a brief of a citation for Dr. Furaha. Furaha Asani is a researcher, mental health advocate, and teacher, born and raised in Nigeria to a Congolese father and an Armenian-Ukrainian mother. She obtained an undergraduate and master's degree in biochemistry from the University of Johannesburg and a PhD in infection and immunity from the University of Sheffield. She's also a writer who has written for several online platforms about issues in higher education, healthcare, and science in pop culture. Furaha is passionate about taking steps towards an equitable higher education system and amplifying the voices of Black students and staff in higher education. She will be discussing problematic practices, not just in academia and research, but also how narratives and stories shape agendas. She will also discuss how we can check our own privileges when we are members of institutions that uphold colonial practices. So on that, I'd like to invite Dr. Furaha to start a presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be part of this whole day. Before I start, I just want to say that most of the organizers and the panelists and the presenters today are either Black people or people of color. And I'm pretty sure that we all saw earlier that we had a lot of racist trolling. So I felt that it was probably necessary for me just to say to all the Black people and the people of color to please take some time for some kind of soothing exercise. It's very easy for us to say, oh, ignore this, this happens all the time, let's not take this seriously, but it's quite hurtful. You know, we can see that racism isn't resting. For those of you who may not know, for a couple of weeks now on Twitter especially, there have been so many, especially Black women, academics coming forward to talk about how on their Zoom meetings and presentations have been trolled, especially for the purpose of writing what we saw earlier, capital N-word. This is really, really hurtful. So please do take some time to, you know, self-soothe after this. So that being said, I'm going to start on my presentation and let's see, share screen. Yeah. So can you all see that?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So just to once again kind of reiterate where my background is, I am a biochemist and I have training in respiratory immunology. So I'm not actually a global health expert. Nonetheless, I have done work in a lot of teaching hospitals, and I want to believe that I have something to offer in this sector. I was born and raised in Nigeria. My father was Congolese, and I have lived in the UK for 6 years. So I think it's very important, especially in light of the fact that I am presenting a case study today of COVID-19 and the African continent. It's important to acknowledge the fact that I am a diasporan, because as Prof Pai and Prof Boum have said so many times, diasporan voices can be pedestaled and amplified over the voices of Black and Brown people in the global South, and that in itself is an injustice. So I just want to acknowledge that I am a diasporan. Great, so we're going to talk really quickly about reframing the colonial narrative of global health using COVID-19 as a case study. This was not initially what I had planned to speak on, but when we found ourselves in this global pandemic, I thought, okay, it's very important that I talk about this, and I changed my talk entirely. So first of all, we all know that we are in this kind of natural disaster, which is COVID-19. And I've decided that I'm going to show you how I believe that Africa, the African continent, and Blackness in particular, has been scapegoated in this entire narrative. So from the beginning, when we heard these rumblings of this disease, we noted, and when I say we, I'm talking particularly about Black people on the Twitter sphere, we noticed that there was a tone that Western media took, which was very much, why don't Africans have this disease? How come is it that we're seeing incidents in the West, you know, versus the African continent? So I think we all knew already what was going to happen at that point in time. There was an article that came out that mentioned that apparently the Olympics, the 2020 Olympics, were cancelled because of the presence of COVID-19 on the African continent. This doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. First of all, how come is it only that when this disease got onto the African continent, was it suddenly a reason for the Olympics to be cancelled? This especially because we have noted, I'm sorry, fire alarm went off in a neighbor's house. I hope they're okay. Yeah, so we noted especially that certain countries had COVID-19 introduced into them because of the phenomenon called ecological imperialism, where a white person introduces disease into a country that is made up of indigenous, Black, or brown people. So again, there's this whole blaming, this tone of blame. We're canceling the Olympics because of Africa. And just to say that this particular article that was released, and I've chosen not to give the name of the article because this is not about me trying to lay blame on the individual journalist. However, when this article was called out, it was updated more than once, showing that they at least did acknowledge that it was problematic, but never once did the publishing house or the journalists themselves come forward to say, okay, the tone of this article is wrong. They just quickly edited it and left it as that. And then there were a number of articles that came out that again took the narrative of how COVID will devastate the global south. I read one of these articles. I didn't find it to be particularly useful, especially because it felt very much like, well, the West is dealing once again with COVID. Yes, it is present in the global south, but does it make sense really to hypothesize about what could potentially happen as opposed to talk about what is happening in the West? It's akin to having your own house on fire and worrying about what the neighbors are doing. So it felt very much, again, like a distraction, trying to throw things onto the global south and take attention off of the fact that basically things were going down in the West. And this also shows this discomfort at the West being associated with the presence of disease. So we'll get more into that. I'm not going to go too deep into the fact that, we know about the French doctors calling for the experimentations on Africans because Prof. Boum has already mentioned that. What was interesting was when Dr. Tedros came, who's the Director General of the World Health Organization, when he came forward and released this very strong statement against what these doctors were seeking to do, his social media was flooded with racist comments. So again, that tells you something. He is standing against, taking an anti-racist stance and is being met with and bombarded with racism. So there was then a journalist on Twitter who came forward and said that they were approached by editors to write an article titled, "Why Africa Will Fail to Control COVID-19." So again, we see this kind of hypothesizing what could happen as opposed to thinking about what is happening, right? And very unfortunately, then we've also seen evidence of COVID-19 related anti-Blackness in China. Very important that when we are calling this out, that we ourselves do not reproduce discrimination against Chinese people who themselves have faced racism, in the context, especially of the origins of this disease. So I'm not suggesting that any of these things have happened as part of kind of a collaboratory or team effort to throw blame onto the African continent. But what I am saying is that it is not hard to connect these dots. And all these dots are showing a pattern that is emerging of a kind of, it's colonialism basically. It's trying to associate this disease with the African continent, which is ultimately trying to associate this disease with Blackness. It is playing the blame game. And last thing that I will say for this slide is that we have seen that, very unfortunately, Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, which itself has taken a tone of blame. Why do I say this? Is because, once again, if you want to get your hand on the pulse of the current cultural moment, go onto any social media platform. And what you will see is that the bioscientists have been discussing about, the underlying genetics of this. How come the Black people and the people of color are more susceptible and more predisposed to COVID-19? Whereas our colleagues in the social sciences and in the humanities have been reminding us that we need to not look at race disattached or unattached, am I using the right word? We need to not look at race as a factor on its own. We cannot strip away history and context and socioeconomic factors and geopolitics from race. We can't strip away scientific racism and race science from race. So you kind of see that bioscientists, we, and I'm going to say we because I'm one of them, we are again looking at the Black body as a legitimate site of experimentation. Basically, that is what we're doing. And I really like what Dr. Grace Okoli says here, and I hope you can all see my cursor, is that just drawing attention only to vitamin D, you know, distracts from the main issues. What is going on here? We can't look at this only as a race issue, because race in itself, when we say race is a social structure, a construct rather, there are so many things attached to race. And I think therein lies the problem in the biosciences, is that we always consider factors as isolated variables, kind of. Very interestingly, and I think responsibly, the NHS are going to launch an inquiry into why Black people and people of color are disproportionately affected by this disease. And I want to believe, I really hope that the task team that they assemble for this is going to be an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary team, because the last thing we need is a team made up of only bioscientists who are only going to think about the immunogenetics. We need all hands on deck and all kinds of ideas, because research rarely can explain a phenomenon holistically. But I think at this point in time, to go beyond the colonial narrative, we need an interdisciplinary approach. So, excuse me, I hope that that makes sense, what I'm saying. Okay, so accountability culture is not a new thing, neither is horizontal accountability, neither is the idea of accountability in global health. Bruin and colleagues wrote quite a good paper on this, I think in 2013, in 2014. There are also brilliant works that have been written recently by Professor Ghislaine Kinwani, who is a professor in critical psychology. There's also a paper written by Dr. Foluke Adebisi, again, just examining how COVID has been associated, and disease particularly, has been associated with Blackness, which follows what we know about history. So the reason that I'm presenting, and please accept my very humble illustrations or a framework that I'm trying to propose here, I think that in light of this pandemic, we need to think about global health and biosciences and clinical research, and implement some kind of accountability culture within. We do have current frameworks of accountability, but I think that the problem many times with our frameworks is they tend to be top to bottom, so in a hierarchy. The advantage with horizontal accountability is that it's suggesting a collaboration between the key players, so that everyone is simultaneously holding themselves and others to account. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So here's my gender neutral stick person. And when I refer to the individual, in the context of what I've just presented, we can say these are the two French doctors. So they said what they said on live TV. They gave some apologies, but I want to know a little bit more. I want to know what they plan to do to redress what they said. I want to know whether they're thinking about the harm that they've caused. I want to know more about their introspection. And you may argue that they don't owe that to me. And I would argue against that, because they did come onto an international station to make the statements that they did. So I think it's only fair that their redress is commensurate, is basically what I'm saying. Now, in terms of an institution, we can think of the World Health Organization, with the Director General, releasing that strong statement and saying, no, we're not gonna let this fly. However, in terms of the institutions where these French doctors work, one of them released a statement that was basically, it was really shallow, leaves a lot to be desired. In terms of the storytellers, well, as I presented on the first slide, we know what's been going down with the media. Again, it's connecting the dots, and it's seeing that people are trying to distract, or not everyone, but there has been this kind of agenda to once again associate COVID-19 with Blackness or with people of color. So I'm talking about specific accountability. Oh, sorry about that. I'm talking about specific accountability between all of these key players at the same time. And I believe that this is what we need to move global health forward, and to kind of reframe our colonial thinking and the stories that we put forward. Now, I am not just here pointing fingers at these individuals and not holding myself to the same standards that I'm trying to hold them up against. I will say that as a bioscientist, I have spent quite a lot of time, especially over the past couple of months, thinking about my own complicity in race science, thinking about my research, thinking about the fact that I have not started questioning race science till maybe a year ago, thinking about my research portfolio, how I can hold myself accountable, how I can show my students openly that I'm holding myself accountable so that they're not scared to do the same thing. I am attached to a research institution. I have been for over, I think it's now 13 years or so. And also I'm a writer. I write in healthcare. I'm thinking about everything that I have done that is problematic. And I am ready, just as the other speakers have said, I'm ready to admit that I myself as a scientist, I am problematic. Now, am I canceling myself? No, that doesn't mean that I have to cancel myself. However, I think it is very important that if I'm going to position myself as an activist in global health, that I do hold my thought processes and everything I'm doing to the light. So beloved, what I'm trying to say is that I have only just started the process of decolonizing my own mind. I am at the beginning of my journey. So I just want to encourage you in conclusion that please do that work, do that introspection. It can be very unpleasant. It can be unpleasant. And I've had these conversations with this person that I mentioned, Dr. Foluke Adebisi, more than once about this unpleasantness and this discomfort, myself being a Black person who is an African as well, and the part that I play in anti-Blackness and in race science, and what do I do about that? And you know, the confusion of it all. And I think integrity is not necessarily, it's not perfection. It's about saying, okay, this is how we've messed up, and this is how we have fed into colonialism and coloniality, and how are we going to redress that? And not just stopping there at you know, giving beautiful presentations, but doing the groundwork. And I think that that is really how we can reframe our own thinking. We can hold ourselves and our institutions to account, and we can do the same with those who are telling our stories. And sometimes we are our own storytellers, as is the case with me. I think it's very, very important that perhaps we draw up some kind of accountability framework for global health if we are really serious about moving forward towards, you know, social justice and equity. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that everything I've said has made sense, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asani. Let's see, a question from Twitter says, COVID-19 responses have highlighted the great practices low middle income countries can teach the global north. How can we flip the script?
Sorry, read that again, sorry.
We'll read again. It says, COVID-19 responses have highlighted the great practices low middle income countries can teach the global north. How can we flip the script?
Okay, so if I'm interpreting this correctly, and I agree with this, is that there's so many things that we, especially in the West, have to learn and humble ourselves and admit that we have to learn from the global South. So I hope that I am understanding this question correctly. And I think what we have to our advantage is documenting our case studies, particularly. This is an entirely different example, but I will give it to you anyway. So there is a case study, beautiful case study from Nigeria from 2003, I think, to 2004. I've often cited this case study. It's about how we had a boycott for the polio vaccine. And there was a very, very strategic way that the northern Nigerian government used to, they used people in the community, from religious leaders, from local government leaders, to just go to their people, go to their communities and speak about this vaccine. And they were able to build confidence in the vaccine within their own communities. So that was like leveraging on relational power. And I think that this kind of, I've actually written a paper about this, about the power of community storytellers in preaching the message of vaccinations, basically. So I think that if we can document first and foremost, because remember that we can do all the good that we want to do, but if there's no way of documenting this, our stories disappear. And then what happens in the future is it's questioned whether or not they actually happened. So I would say that documenting is the first way to do this, obviously ethically, so that Africans and people of color are telling our own stories. I think right now, because everyone is relying on hot takes and quick fire responses, it's hard to get in there, but I definitely think documentation and storytelling is where we need to begin. I hope that in part answers the question.
It does. Thank you very much. And the second question is, what role do you see mental health playing in decolonization for ethnic minorities and also potentially for non-ethnic minorities population?
Okay, great question. I live with mental illness. I've lived with mental illness my whole life. I do not have a memory without intense anxiety. So I will tell you that when I talk about doing this decolonization work in my own mind, my mind is a mind that is always on fire anyway, with so many thoughts. I have my coping strategies, I do. But I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that I don't get overcome by feelings such as guilt, by extreme anxiety about whether or not I'm saying the right thing at the right time. So it is not an easy process at all. But what I am going to assure you is that it is very, very possible to do it. So sometimes what we need to do is look at the overarching goal and break it down into manageable chunks, because we need to be healthy. We need to be healthy. The last thing that I would want is for all of us to reach whatever finish line we're aiming for and all be burnt out. It does happen, but what I will say is please and please do what you can, self-soothe, take care of yourself, learn how your system works, and then keep going, keep going. There's a pastor of mine from back home who says, even if you reach the finish line crawling, just get to the finish line. So take care of yourself, please. I know that right now it's easier said than done. In this pandemic, there's so much that we are being bombarded with, that we don't know what is happening. We don't know when the lockdown will be lifted. A lot of us, I'm a migrant in the UK, a lot of us are worried about our families. So also there needs to be kindness. We need to be kind to ourselves. We don't know, we've not faced this before. We don't know what we're doing. So we need to really be kind to ourselves. Whatever feelings that you're having, it's absolutely fine. Okay, so I'm very, very happy to talk more about this on Twitter. Just reach out to me and we can discuss more.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mariana.
I was just going to ask if we were going to ask Professor Yap.
Yes, go ahead.
Good. Welcome back, Professor Yap. I'm so sorry that you got cut off. I also wanted to give you some minutes. I know you were in the middle of a thought when you got cut off. If you wanted to finish that, or if you would rather I went straight to questions, it's up to you.
No, actually, I was just finishing with showing the combination that is being done locally. That my daughter was wearing, because again, the personal protective equipment, we've been waiting for them. We know that we don't have enough. They're coming from China, and unfortunately, we are not a priority as the low and middle income countries. And because we are not the priorities, how are we going to handle what is happening if we don't have our own way of producing them? So that's what I was showing. And the last thing I was saying is that we need to encourage the local production of solution to address our own challenge. And what you are doing in that conference, and I also joined Professor Madhu in saying that the youth that you are the hope to think differently. Just to mention decolonizing global health, I mean, that's bold enough to say that we want to see things different, and I cannot encourage you more to keep working on that.
Thank you very much for that. So we have some questions from Twitter for you. Juan asks, I would like to know if Professor Yap has opinions on how US policies influence Latin America, and if we can talk about decolonizing when we're talking about the continent of Latin America.
Yes, okay, I'm not a specialist of Latin America, but what I remember is when I was in Uganda. I was in Uganda and we were having a great collaboration with doctors who were coming from Colombia to support what we were doing in Barra Hospital. And that, when I was talking with them, they were telling us how the fact that they were kind of banned by the US helped them to kind of be more resilient. And they were now the one coming and supporting us, the same thing that they were doing in Ebola. So when those policies definitely affect Latin America or any other continent because they reduce the amount of money that can reach there, they force us to find our own solution. I'm always trying to figure out what was happening before colonization. What was happening? Either in Latin America or in Africa. Were people all dying? Of course, no. They were finding their own solution to fit the challenge that they were having. They were using traditional medicine, they were using the herbal plant and so on and so forth. So why are we now trying to push out all of that? Because we have the support and the help coming from the West? No, I think it's not one or the other. It's both hands. We need to figure out how one can complement the other, so that when we are stuck, or even before, we can prevent and say, okay, for this disease, I'm going to use that. For other, I'm going to use the other alternative.
Thank you very much. And the next question is, in your article, Advancing Equitable Global Health Research Partnerships in Africa, which if the audience hasn't read, I encourage you to do. So you mentioned mentorships as a way of career development within research partnerships. Would you please expand on that, or how do you envision that happening in a more equitable way, if you can?
Yeah, in the more equitable way. I go back to the time when I was in Uganda leading the Epicenter Research Center in Barara. And at that time, we were having partnership with folks from Harvard, for University of Virginia in the US, and then they were sending quite a number of their students to come, and they were most of them coming from global health and other from surgery and others. So, and then we were partnering, and I was supervising some of their students, and I told them that that is unfair. I mean, you bring your student, they learn something. Why don't we also have the opportunity to send our student to you? And I remember one of my good friends who told me that, you know, we don't have funding, in the sense that the people who would sponsor those students to come to Africa don't sponsor Africans to come to the US. And because your people are not sponsoring them, they're stuck. And what I did, I wrote an email to them. I told them, okay, if my student cannot go to the US, I stop the program. Simply. And within 48 hours, they were able to find something for one of my students to go to the US for 2 or 3 weeks of training. So I think where there is a will, there is a way. So in the mentoring program, what we try to do is to have the capacity to partner. I have some African-based students, I have some US or Europe-based students. They work together from the time of starting the project that they are working on, because of course I'm a researcher, and they will work toward that program all along. I have a very good friend, Sunil from University of Yale, Professor Parik, who actually currently we are having some students from Yale working with students from University of Yaoundé on malaria program. And that helps us to mentor not only the student, but also our faculties. Because not all faculty that we have in our African university have been exposed to world-class research. But having those partnerships really also help them. So we mentor the student, but we also mentor the faculties so that they learn and they end up having no complex of being with the Western researchers. This is how I'm seeing it. And I work a lot with African Leadership Academy, who actually select some of those students connected to me, and then we can find where to post them. And I would be happy if we can have more and more students and make it more global, where we can have those partnerships and having the different faculties working together and mentoring young researchers.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Yap, for that. I think one key takeaway is that we need more equitable global health partnerships. We need partnerships that are equitable from both the global south and the global north. And those are things that as young global health professionals should get imprinted in our minds so that when we get out there, we know how to navigate this part. So thank you once more for joining us again. And thank you for your incredible knowledge that you shared. So for the last speaker of the day, joining us from London will be Dr. Ngozi Erondu for her presentation, where she'll be wrapping up the entire session. And I'll be taking a citation. Dr. Ngozi Erondu is the Chief Executive for Project Zambesi, a public-private partnership created to improve access to essential medicines throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Erondu trained as an infectious disease epidemiologist and works as a policy advisor on global health governance and health systems. She currently consults as a senior research fellow at the Chatham House Center for Universal Health, and she's also a senior public health advisor at Public Health England. Previously, Dr. Erondu was an assistant professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where she taught outbreak response and epidemiology. She often provides technical support to the US Centers for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, and governments across sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and the Southeast Asia to strengthen capacities in controlling infectious diseases such as Ebola, meningitis, malaria, and polio. She sits on the boards of Imperial Health Charity and Castle Pines Medical Foundation and is a fellow at the Aspen Institute and the Johns Hopkins University Emerging Leader in Biosecurity Program. Let's welcome Dr. Ngozi for our presentation.
Thank you so much, Anikan. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let me just share my screen. Hoping everyone can see my screen. Okay, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really grateful to the organizers at the University of Edinburgh. It's a real privilege to be here. Like many of us, I feel like a bridge sometimes. I exist in privilege, but I empathize with inequities and sometimes experience these myself. So like many of the panelists, my observations, they represent my experience, but they also represent the experiences of others that I spoke to, especially when I do outbreak response or different preparedness work with ministries of health across the MENA region, the Sub-Saharan Africa region, and Southeast Asia. So today I want to talk to you about how institutions, now I'll talk primarily about academic and research institutions, but this can go beyond that. It can go to the think tank that I work at, Chatham House, it can include that as well. But how institutions actually create and perpetuate inequity in global health. I'm going to discuss this in 3 parts. First, I'll talk about familiar global health story that I think everyone will know, and it really illustrates the consequence of inequities in global health. In the second part, I'll share some personal experiences, as well as wider trends of structural inequities in global health. And third and final part is quite brief, but just I'll put out some suggestions of some mind shifts that we can have and that our institutions can have in order to combat these inequities individually and institutionally. Okay, so I want you to put yourself into this image, and I want you to envision a young doctor. He's just returned from this practically empty hospital, and he reflects on the villagers that he had encountered that day. Many of them were bleeding and they were feverish, and they all were just desperate to survive. Now, he had seen malaria, he'd seen cholera and meningitis, and this mysterious disease looked like it was all of them and none of them at the same time. Tired, he looks down at his hands and he sees that in the palms of his hands, there's dried blood. And so he runs off to wash his hands. Now, this young man will eventually find a very sick nun and then persuade her to leave the mission hospital and go with him to the capital city, where he would be able to take a blood sample from her. And her blood samples would ultimately produce the first isolated Ebola virus, which would be analyzed and characterized by scientists in Belgium and in the US. Okay, so let's go to the part of the story that we all know a bit more. This is a couple of months ago when I Googled who discovered Ebola, and Professor Peter Piot, the director of the university I used to work at, his name shows up immediately. This is just one of the many articles that were written about Professor Piot and how he discovered Ebola. And so when most of us hear the story of Ebola, especially most of us being, outside of the people that are attending this, this conference, we believe that the story starts here with Professor Piot, who was a young scientist. He was part of the Belgium team to transport and then analyze the samples of Ebola. And we don't think that the story actually begins with the young man at the beginning of the story, which is Dr. Jean-Jacques Moyembe. Now, Dr. Moyembe, as he is called, bravely assessed, treated, and looked after the first known cases of Ebola, with no gloves and no protective personal equipment. Dr. Moyembe and the original clinical team in Kinshasa are as important to the story of Ebola as Professor Piot, as the CDC, and as the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Belgium. So my question to you is this: who decides who appears and disappears in the story of scientific achievement and discovery? And I think this is super resonant right now, right? When the world has entered our world of science and epidemiology and public health, our world where the average person now understands a bit about transmission and even relative risk, a world where we gather every evening to applaud health workers because they are quite literally putting their lives on the line for us. Well, in 1976, there was no applause for Dr. Moyembe or his team, and for many decades following that. I think that few people know that most global health stories are as complementary and as complex as this. We often only hear one side. And we hear this one side very early in our public health careers. Few institutions understand that ensuring equity and representation in global health is not about revisionist history. It's not about minimizing the accomplishments of Europeans or white majority institutions. It is simply about inclusion and fairness. And fairness is what I had in mind when I wrote this article for Stat News last February. I had recently stopped working at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine after 8 years. Half of that time was as a doctoral student and half of that time was as an assistant professor. When I was a student, I witnessed several of my classmates from low and middle income countries or just non-UK countries struggle with their white doctoral supervisors or other staff members. For example, I know of at least 3 students, one from East Asia, one from Africa, one from the Caribbean, who did not finish their PhDs. And this is not an easy feat. I mean, not finishing your PhD is pretty extraordinary, especially in the UK. And all of them had issues communicating with their supervisors. And you will know that there's usually, depending on what country you're from, but especially when you're not from the West, there's usually stronger hierarchical, there's a stronger hierarchical culture in those countries. So it's much more difficult to voice your discontent with an authority. But to me, it was also really sad because it didn't seem like the supervisors tried at all, and they ultimately just left them to fail. And when I became a professor, I had my own uncomfortable experiences. Initially, I was quite surprised at how dismissive some of my students were. And then I thought, okay, it's just me, it's probably imposter syndrome. So I would take days, sometimes weeks, just to prepare for a course. But I noticed that, especially with my European students, things didn't really change in regards to how they respected me or, acknowledged me as their professor. Now you may be thinking, okay, you had 3 fellow students and then yourself. That is a pretty small sample size. But then in January 2019, this study was published in The Lancet, and it really helped me to understand that I wasn't just imagining these things. I'm sure that you probably have had similar experience. I definitely, from hearing the other panelists, I think it's really good to see ourselves within the research and have the evidence to kind of back up all these feelings. Well, this study, it was led by researchers at the London School and the National University of Singapore. it sought to understand if the top public health universities were safeguarding fairness and inclusion, or if they were just talking about it. And they did this by analyzing the 15 top US, UK, and Canadian universities. So you see on the left this graph, and sorry, I should have said at the beginning, I have graphs and information on the left and right, and so it depends on where your kind of picture panel is. So you might want to move that to the top. Yeah, so they found similar statistics that Professor Pai presented earlier. Overall, there was still a wide gap in gender and ethnic representation in senior positions. Across all universities, women were concentrated at junior positions and men at senior positions. And the representation of women declined between the middle and senior academic levels, despite women outnumbering men at the junior level. And this effect was magnified for ethnic minority women, who made up 19% of the junior staff and only 9% of the senior level staff. In contrast, white men represented about 25% of the junior staff, but rose to 46% at the senior level. So I think if you just look at the trajectories, just look at the light blue line and the purple line, it just really says a lot. The light blue line is ethnic minority women, and the purple line are white men. It says a lot about our career trajectories in academia, in schools of public health. Well, this study emboldened me to add my personal experience to these numbers. When I first wrote my piece, I did not expect it to be part of the Decolonize Global Health discussion, but of course it is. My experience, the findings from this Lancet study, and the stories, so many personal stories that I've heard since I wrote my piece, speak about the same issue: persistent institutionalized discrimination. So this is the definition that I'm using for institutional discrimination: unfair indirect treatment of certain members within a group that are often, these practices are often embedded into really the structures, the policies of the institutions that we represent. So now I know that we're all good people, right? And I find that most of my colleagues across the various institutions that I've worked with, they're good people, you know, at London School, at WHO, at CDC, at Chatham House. And so what do good people do? Good people hear these things, it disturbs them, they're uncomfortable with it, and they try to fix it. But sometimes the cure can be harmful as well. So I really want us to remember during this talk that the solutions to institutional discrimination is not just like, you know, adding a Malaysian to this panel and having like a woman be in a specific commission. It's not about sprinkling diversity everywhere. That's not okay. And tokenism is the practice of making only perfunctory or symbolic efforts in order to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of people from underrepresented groups in order to give the appearance of gender or racial equality within a workforce. So now let's talk about some challenges to inclusion and local ownership in science. One big issue that several people have spoke about already is publication bias and lack of, you know, the global South or Southern scientists being represented in our literature. Now, it's well documented that there is a bias in scientific publications for men, for English-speaking authors, and from authors from certain institutions. The current publishing model is frankly just full of unconscious bias. I mean, some will argue very conscious bias in some ways. One study found that manuscripts from high-income countries had a 6 times greater odd of being accepted for publication than articles from low and middle-income countries. Now, this obviously hurts the authors that are overlooked, but it also limits scientific progress. The same study looked at the minimal articles that were submitted by the low and middle income authors, and it showed that it greatly increased the topic diversity in those journals. In a globalized world, I think of the importance of diseases that may show up in the South, and what a pity if we're not documenting it. As Dr. Asani said, if we're not documenting it and we're not understanding the epidemiology and the pathology of emerging and re-emerging diseases. Now, I hope in today's environment, this is even more poignant, something that we all can agree on. But beyond this, I think that many of the reasons that we still do not see a lot of, first authors from Africa or Southeast Asia or Latin America, the reasons why we don't see them publishing is because we do science with very different motivations. So one of my colleagues I was speaking to, who works at a really great institution in Kenya, she told me that many of my white colleagues do science to build their careers through publications. They are on an intellectual exploration. But for me, it's a need to solve a crucial problem that may be hurting or killing my people. And so these motivations obviously affect our output. Seriously, who has time to publish when you're fighting Ebola or you're in the lab 24/7 trying to figure out a vaccine for COVID-19 or sequencing the gene? I mean, who has time for that? Now, obviously, this is not applicable to every Northern or every Southern scientific situation, but I do think it highlights something very important. To contribute to academic literature, you need to have the time to think and to write. Now, there's a risk to apply a tokenistic solution here. So I was involved in the response to Ebola in Guinea. And during that time, many of my African counterparts who are super brilliant, very good at their field work, they had some great ideas for publications, but they didn't have the time to write them. One particularly, well, let me back up. Yeah, they didn't have the time to write any of these publications. And yet, months later, I would see their names on these publications and I would ask them, like, did you write this publication? And obviously their names were just put on. One particularly bright colleague of mine, he actually came from Guinea to London to study for his MSc. And I quickly realized that there was no way that he could have written some of these papers. And he even had 2 papers that he was listed as first author. And I'm glad he did learn to write scientifically at London School, because I know now that he can actually shape the science and the policy recommendations that come from future papers. He can actually shape the story of science and the story of outbreak response, as Professor Boum eloquently said earlier. So yeah, let's insist, and when we get into those positions, insist that we do not tokenistically just add people to papers. So I also just wanted to highlight that it matters where knowledge is generated. Professor Pai spoke about this earlier, so I won't go into it too deeply, but I'm sure that we all can recognize these logos and the powerhouses that they represent in terms of power and influence in global health. And we know that many of these were actually colonial institutions put in place after World War I. So one thing that I keep doing during this COVID-19 outbreak is really checking myself. So I find myself wanting to criticize some of the public health measures that are coming out of India or Rwanda or different things, and instead of thinking that they have their own cultures and their own context and their own customs, and that they're going to use alongside of science. So people in the West, we clearly do not have all the answers, and that's why we're having so many challenges as well. And so my question is, why are Northern institutions the most influential in global health? Why are their solutions being what is lifted up as right? So another shortcoming in academia is the lack of staff diversity. Barriers resulting from institution level practices and norms can stifle career success among underrepresented groups. It's documented that affinity bias, so just promoting people who look like you or have a similar background, that systematically affects minorities throughout their career. The lack of role models, especially of females and women of color, have a devastating impact on students. As a professor, I could see that there was a desire all the time, for this shared experience. And it was really magnified when I worked with people from low and middle income countries. Because of my background, because of my age, many African students, they felt more comfortable confiding in me or asking me questions than they may have been with, my older, whiter, more male colleague. So it's really hard to overstate the importance of ensuring that we have qualified people of color around the table. Again, I think there's a knee-jerk reaction for some institutions to just hire people of color, but there are many qualified, just like there's qualified people all around the world. We just need to we just need to do better at ensuring that our practices for hiring, where we post job descriptions, how we recruit, that they really take into consideration how to be more inclusive, how to reach people that may not, you know, be on Twitter all day. No, I have nothing's wrong with Twitter. I'm on Twitter all day as well. But you know, there are other people out there. I just want to say the last thing about this is that one of the loudest statements an institution can make is its silence on representation. So I've spent a lot of time articulating the issues of lack of inclusion and fairness in global health institutions. And instead of prescribing solutions, I'm just going to kind of suggest some mind shifts that institutions and individuals can use to self-correct. So first of all, we need to deconstruct structural prejudice and colonial tendencies by making room for different perspectives. I think that anyone who works in a global health institution has to have training in inclusion and diversity, and this is definitely not happening. We need to think of different forums to hear voices that may not be as comfortable speaking up in department meetings. And finally, we need data. We should all be asking our institutions for data on gender and ethnicity representation in our institutions, so that we can interrogate those data and see if we have any disparities and then seek a solution. I think we all need to be part of a new model of dignified international partnerships. And I love what Professor Boum talked about, you know, building equitable partnerships. So we need to start from the start. We need to be honest about why we want to collaborate with Southern institutions if we represent Northern institutions. And we need to begin an intellectual journey of research with our partners from the study question, the research question. And something that Professor Pai said earlier was about, you know, this phenomenon where the Northern institution actually runs everything, has all the money. We need to start investing in building both administrative and technical research skills in partner countries. It's just not okay to keep running Southern-based projects in European and North American countries. And mentorship matters. And so, you know, Professor Boum spoke about this a little bit, but you don't have to run a research project to make a difference. Everyone attending this call can be a peer mentor and an advocate within our universities, but also in the field that all of you will eventually get to. I've seen entire organizations change when people who are trained at places like University of Edinburgh work to change their workplace environments. So I really think we need to all be part of, you know, thinking about how we can support each other to lean in, as Professor Pai mentioned. So if you leave with anything today from this talk, remember that decolonizing global health and ending institutional discrimination starts with the individual, but ends with the institution. Institutional norms are upkept and perpetuated when enough of us acquiesce to the status quo. So no matter how harmful the consequences are. So conferences like this are phenomenal, and our individual actions do matter. So just to end, Dr. Moyembe, he's dedicated the last 4 decades to public health in Democratic Republic of Congo and to fighting Ebola. In fact, he's taken part in every Ebola outbreak and is leading the current response to Ebola and COVID-19 today. He heads the DRC's National Institute for Biomedical Research in Kinshasa, and he was also the 2019 recipient of the Noguchi Africa Prize, which is a really esteemed award. He's a public health hero that very few people in public health know about. And I'm certain that there are hundreds of Moyembes and Professor Piot's even that have come and will come through the door of the University of Edinburgh and our respective institutions. So we just need to make sure that they have a fair foundation so they can be as great as they can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an amazing presentation. I personally have really learned a lot. But I think one thing I've gotten is that if we have to decolonize global health, it has to come from a position of fairness and inclusion. If we take those 2 key things out, then we're missing things that are very important. And I hope that as many as I've heard, the participants will be able to begin thinking about how we can be more inclusive and fair, and also looking at ourselves, how we can look at our positionality and our advantages and use to to advance the discussion about decolonizing global health. So thank you once again, Dr. Ngozi, for such an amazing presentation. We're grateful for that. We would like to head to Mariana for some questions. Mariana?
Yes. First question from the audience. As a Black woman in academia, how do you manage the idea of the angry Black woman when we bring up these issues? Some people think we're always moaning and not moving on. How do we manage critique and positive action?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So interestingly enough, I was a professor in London, in the UK, and not in the States. And so I think, you know, context matters. Not to say that the perception of an angry Black woman is not in the UK, but it's not as much. It's more like kind of the loud American, probably got that more. I think it's important to be wise and to find allies. That's what I'll say. You'll notice that I didn't write that article until after I left London School. And I've heard panelists talk earlier about being established. I mean, I wanted to write that for years. And, you know, like timing matters. I also had some allies, the folks who wrote the Lancet paper. I mean, we didn't coordinate it or anything, but I knew them. I knew that they were doing some research there. And so I really thought it would be better to kind of piggyback off of, you know, kind of science and evidence other than just telling my own story. So it's tricky because, you know, Black women especially, we're always a minority. We're always, you know, we always kind of have the brunt of some of these things, but it's possible, yeah. Oh, I can't hear you, sorry.
Unmute.
Sorry about that. The next question is, what do you see as the more immediate risks of tokenization in global health research?
I think the immediate risk would be that I think it actually really hurts the scientists involved. I'm more concerned of like the southern voices or the southern scientists that it hurts. I think that when someone is not brought into a place because of their merit, imposter syndrome is even more rife, really. I also think that having someone that is brought on because of their race or their gender, it also just hurts the science. We're not getting the best voices at the table anyway. But I will say that tokenism also can be used to for advantages. I mean, a lot of times, you know, people that are qualified are chosen not because like they're necessarily wanted, but because there needs to be some type of balance, and it look bad if the department doesn't hire any minorities. So we can obviously use that for our advantage as well, and I think we should. And like for me, when I was at London School, I don't know why I was hired. I mean, I did a PhD and I think I do good work. I'm not going to say I was hired as a token. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying like I used that platform as much as I could to bring in other students, to highlight the challenges in the countries that I was working on. I think the presentations, the speakers that I invited were very different than, you know, my colleagues. And so we should definitely use that platform if we're brought in that way.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, Professor Boum wants to ask Dr. Ngozi.
Okay, I'll ask Dr. Erondu one more question. You mentioned from the anecdote from this colleague who was brilliant, was working in Africa, and that resonated with me in the way you mentioned the difference in the way maybe people coming from lower middle income countries like myself, we write different, and how he was more acquainted in the way of writing or publishing once he did an MSc in London. And how would you like that to move on? Should we as low middle income country researchers learn another way of writing to be able to put our ideas into this other sphere? Should we find a way to make our own ways of writing or publishing, and this other focus that you mentioned, the other focus we have sometimes for more immediate science, who should make the compromise?
Oh, I mean, that's such a great question. I kind of spoke with Ines about this a couple of days ago. It's like, do we build our own table or do we make sure we have a seat at the existing table, right? And I think we just have to do both. I mean, I think that some people, like he was French speaking, so it wasn't just like, you know, so he was French speaking and he had to write for an English, you know, MSc basically. So there were a lot of things that he had to shift, and he was also mostly field based. And I think that obviously there is, you know, this kind of accepted global, and I won't even say global because it's really English speaking Northern institutions that dominate the publishing field. And I think that some of us are good writers, and we're good writers in English. Do you know what I mean? And I think that those people, they do need, like Professor Boum and Professor Mai, and, you know, like they do need to keep writing and highlighting this to the powers that be. But then I do think that folks like you, the University of Edinburgh, like you all should be looking at building your own table as well. Like I'm also excited about what young people are doing, because we shouldn't have to subscribe to these institutions that are already set up and us all just trying to fight each other to get there. There are other ways to communicate science. There are other stories that need to be told, and they don't necessarily need to be told in an English or an Anglo-American way, you know? So hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think Professor Pai has a question. Professor Pai?
I think it's less of a question, but more as a reflection. Listening to these presentations makes me wonder that people of color, people from LMICs, sometimes when we have a chance to step into a leadership role, either we give up because we're not even able to reach a level where we can get into a leadership role. The system has already burnt us out by then. Or we think we're not good enough to lead. But if we are able to somehow overcome that and get into a leadership role, then I think we can do some dramatic things in terms of how we can change the system, right? So for example, Tedros becoming the DG of WHO is a huge accomplishment. It shattered an incredibly important ceiling, right? Or I so enjoy seeing, say, Bimbola as the editor of BMJ Global Health. What a difference just being him as editor-in-chief, I think, has made to the entire culture of a journal, which is dominated by high-income countries. He's able to elevate voices which probably would never normally would have made it into a British journal of all journals, right? I mean, these are bastions of colonialism, and yet he's able to change it because he's an editor-in-chief. So I think as hard as it is and as hostile it might be for people to kind of move through the ranks to reach a leadership role, I mean, I myself am a very reluctant leader. And in fact, I'm about to give up my leadership role in global health. It's because I feel like I want to go back and do what I'm good at, and I don't necessarily feel like I want to be leading. But I wonder sometimes whether that's a disservice, because how do we then change the existing power structures if people who can lead and who are able to think diverse and inclusion are somehow not in the leadership role? So this is a tension that I see, and I don't think I have a good answer. But for example, I would have been, wouldn't it have been amazing to see someone like Ngozi leading the London School, right? Think about how much she could change if she reached the highest level in that institution, which is extremely colonial even today, as we know. I mean, so this is the challenge, but then the system doesn't even maybe encourage her to even go all the way, which is a loss. At the same time, I don't know how to break that ceiling so that more people are able to lead. Like, why can't we have a woman president in the United States? How big a difference that would have made to the country, right? This is the challenge and the opportunity, and I'm not saying I have an answer, but I'm just throwing it out there for discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Pai. I don't know if there's any other speaker that would want to probably provide a final comment or reflection before my colleague Luis comes over and wraps it up for us.
I kind of wanted just to respond to Professor Pai. Dr. Asani, do you want to say something first? Okay, just checking. I think it's so funny because I wrestled with that, not about being the director of London School, but I wrestled with staying and what staying would do. And I think what I would encourage everyone on this call is just to think about, like, you have to honor yourself as well as honor the cause, right? And it's kind of like what Dr. Asani said about like taking care of yourself. Yeah, I mean, we are passionate, we want change, but I never wanted to be an academic, you know? I was an academic, I did what I had to do, and I still write quite a bit. I still do a lot of research, but I wanted to inflict or influence change in a different way. And so I would love to be part, you know, to have the honor of being part of a mentorship group that inspires the next leader for London School, you know, or Oxford or Duke or whatever. I would love to be part of that. And I think we all can play that. But I think when we think that as individuals, we have to honor the God-given gifts that we have in order to make a change. That's where we'll see like the biggest change, I think. But yeah, I appreciate your point, Professor Pai.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Dr. Ngozi. I'd like to hand over to Louis.
Yes, thank you, Aniken. So this brings us to the end of our conference. Thank you to all of our fantastic speakers and all of our attendees for all of your valuable contributions today. And thank you for bearing with us with the technical issues at the beginning, but I will say I don't think I've been in a Zoom call that didn't have any issues. So just to sort of sum up some thoughts, although there have been so many great nuggets of wisdom throughout today, just really to reiterate that this prevailing issue of colonialism is an invisible power that continues to influence institutional structures and ideologies, so not just in academia, but also in policy fields and in other areas, as our speakers have mentioned. And it's these power dynamics that shape the direction of global health and significantly influence, as we know, and intersect with other problematic ideologies, so racism, sexism, classism. And there are still many that are not aware of what the colonial impact is and why it still prevails. So our aim today, as Professor Pai mentioned, with waking people up from the matrix and taking the red pill, was to do that through a meaningful discussion that we've had and to bring the movement across the pond from the US, from Harvard and Duke, not just to here, because of course being in Edinburgh, it's still a high income country, but we want to really use this as an inspiration to inspire others to take this movement forward to other cities around the world. So I hope we've achieved that collectively by challenging ourselves and holding ourselves and our institutions to account. We as organizers have learned a lot during the process of just hosting this conference. So now, how do we go about changing these structures and processes of work? And that's much easier said than done, and Rome wasn't built in a day, but we can start using our privileges to lean out, to allow other voices to sort of occupy the space, as our speakers have mentioned, that many of us on this panel are, from the diaspora, so we ourselves hold some level of privilege. So people in positions of power that are listening, so our attendees, I want to challenge you to think, for instance, where you can help. So who are the people that you're hiring, and who are the people that you're co-authoring papers with? So as Dr. Erondu put very nicely, it's not just about sprinkling diversity. We want to actually make meaningful change past sort of tokenism. So now that we're awake, as it were, what practical actions can we take with us moving forward after today? So we as organizers, we're really keen for this not just to be like other conferences where you sit and listen, it's interesting, but then you don't take any practical steps afterwards. So we have decided personally to have a virtual internal workshop at Edinburgh to discuss what we've learned here today and how we can take this movement forward in our daily lives. So we're hoping to put together a document of what we've learned and sort of a practical checklist of things we can do specifically. So we hope to continue these discussions as well through interviews with others and to potentially develop a podcast series. So we would challenge you to take what we've discussed today to your own institutions and workplaces, and to think about, as Dr. Asani mentioned, that horizontal accountability structure. So you as an individual, what are the institutions you're linked to, and where are you promoting stories, and how are you telling these stories, and who are you telling stories of and with? So we hope to share any outputs with you. We have a mailing list, and due to the sort of restrictions with Zoom interactions, please feel free to send us emails. Our email should have been given already, but in case it wasn't, we can post it on our Twitter, but it's dghedinburgh@gmail.com. So that brings us to the end of our conference. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see this movement grow and evolve. Thank you, everyone.
Great job, everyone,
Thank
especially
you.
all the students.
Yeah.
Awesome job.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining in. Appreciate it. Thank you.